Ellie Granger sat in the quiet hum of the university's archive, bathed in the faint glow of a dusty desk lamp. Her fingers brushed across a pile of old manuscripts, the musty scent of history clinging to her skin. It was the third hour of her late-night research session, and the shadows had deepened. The kind of silence that filled the room seemed to press in on her, making her feel more isolated than she cared to admit. As a history professor, Ellie was used to spending hours poring over documents, untangling the mysteries of the past. She thrived in these quiet moments, lost in the stories of civilizations long gone. But lately something had changed. She wasn't sure when it happened, but her research no longer felt like an academic pursuit. It had become an obsession. Tonight, however, the obsession took a new turn. As she sifted through a stack of dusty boxes pushed to the far corner of the archive's backroom, Ellie's hand brushed against something unusual. It wasn't a manuscript or a piece of ancient pottery. It was something far more out of place. Box. Metal aged, and intricately engraved with symbols she didn't recognize. Her breath caught as her fingers traced the strange patterns. She'd been in this archive long enough to recognize every artifact, every object. Nothing like this had ever been catalogued. Nothing this strange. The box was sealed with a heavy bronze clasp. Ellie tried to open it but found it was locked. She frowned. There was no record of a sealed item in this room, let alone something like this. A part of her wanted to leave it, to call it a curiosity best left alone. But the pull of the unknown was too strong. Her curiosity won out. With a quick glance around the room, she retrieved a small set of tools from her bag. Nothing too fancy, just a tiny crowbar and a screwdriver. She worked quickly but with care, prying open the box. When the lid finally gave way, Ellie was met with a soft, almost reverent light. Inside the box was a collection of items, each more perplexing than the last. A small glass vial filled with a substance that shimmered faintly, like liquid starlight. A smooth, metallic disc with strange engravings, partially worn away by time, yet still legible. And a folded letter, its edges yellowed with age, but the handwriting clear, urgent. She unfolded the letter. The words were strangely familiar, yet alien. The message wasn't written in any language she knew, yet somehow she understood it. It was a warning. To whoever finds this, you will soon learn the truth. The disaster cannot be stopped. You are the key, and the choice will be yours. The future depends on you, but remember, time is fragile. Choose wisely, or all will be lost. Ellie stared at the letter, a chill creeping up her spine. The words didn't make sense. A disaster. The future. But none of it mattered, not yet. Her thoughts began to race, her academic mind already trying to piece together the mystery. Who had left this here? And why her? She glanced back at the box, her mind still reeling from what she had just read. The vial and the disc seemed to hum faintly in the dim light, almost as if they were calling out to her. She could feel the weight of the letter in her hands, its words lingering in the back of her mind like a haunting refrain. Suddenly, the door to the archive room creaked open, breaking her concentration. Ellie quickly tucked the box and its contents under the desk, her heart thudding in her chest. She sat up straighter and wiped her hands on her jeans, trying to compose herself. "Ellie!" A voice called softly from the doorway. It was Dr. Rowan, the university's eccentric scientist. "What are you still doing here?" "It's late." Ellie forced a smile. Dr. Rowan had always been a fixture in the university. His work on temporal anomalies was well known, though most of it was relegated to the margins of scientific inquiry. She wasn't sure if she found him fascinating or maddening. "I was just finishing up some research," she said, her voice steady despite the strange feeling in her chest. "What's up?" Dr. Rowan stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the shelves, the desk, and the stacks of papers. He seemed distracted, his mind elsewhere. "I've been reviewing some of the old records. Strange things happening in the city. People disappearing, missing time. I think I'm onto something. Maybe you could take a look." Ellie nodded absent-mindedly, her mind still on the box. But she knew better than to ignore Dr. Rowan's warning. Missing time. That phrase hung in her thoughts like a whisper in the dark. "I'll have a look tomorrow," she said, standing up from the desk. "I need some sleep, I think." As she turned to leave, Dr. Rowan hesitated. "Ellie, don't get too caught up in the past," he said, his voice unusually serious. "Sometimes the past can be more dangerous than we think." The door closed behind him, leaving Ellie in the stillness once more. She stood there for a moment, the weight of his words settling over her. What did he mean? Her fingers found the box again, and she quickly pushed it into her bag. She couldn't leave it here. She had to know what it was. It wasn't until she reached her apartment later that night that she had a moment to breathe. The small living room was dim, the city lights casting long shadows through the blinds. Ellie sat on her couch, the box now open before her. The strange vial and disc stared back at her, the letter still in her hand. She read it again, the words no less cryptic, no less ominous. But this time something was different. She felt it in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. Something was coming, something she couldn't yet comprehend. Her phone buzzed suddenly on the coffee table, snapping her from her thoughts. The message was from Dr. Rowan. "Ellie, I think you should leave that box alone. Trust me, you have no idea what you've just uncovered." Ellie's stomach tightened. She stared at the message, her fingers hovering over the screen. For the first time, she wasn't sure what she was dealing with. And that feeling, that creeping sense of dread, only grew as she placed the phone back on the table. Was the warning real? Was the disaster he mentioned already set in motion? And if so, what could she do to stop it? Ellie's gaze drifted back to the box, the faint glow from the vial casting an eerie light on her face. She had just unearthed something bigger than she had ever anticipated, and now there was no turning back. Ellie woke to the sharp ring of her phone. She didn't recognize the number. With a groan, she rubbed her eyes and sat up in bed, the weight of last night's discovery still heavy on her mind. The capsule, the letter, the warning. It felt like a dream, but she knew it wasn't. She had tucked the box under her bed, and even as the morning sunlight streamed through her blinds, the unease hadn't left her. "Ellie," a voice said on the other end, breaking through her thoughts. "It's Dr. Rowan. I need you to listen carefully." She rubbed her forehead, blinking as if waking from a fog. "What is it, Dr. Rowan?" "I've been doing some digging," he continued, his voice tight. "There's more to that capsule you found than you know. Much more." Ellie swung her legs over the edge of the bed, the floor cool beneath her feet. "What do you mean?" "I can't explain it over the phone," he said. "But we need to meet. Now." The urgency in his voice sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. "Where?" "The park by the university," he replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I'll be waiting." She didn't waste time with pleasantries, hanging up the phone and pulling herself together. As she dressed quickly, the thought of Dr. Rowan's warning lingered in her mind like an itch she couldn't scratch. What did he know about the capsule? And why was he suddenly so insistent? She had hoped the mystery would unravel slowly, that she could control it, but now it seemed as if it was spiraling faster than she could keep up. The air was damp as she stepped outside, the clouds hanging low over the city. It felt as if the world itself was holding its breath. She didn't like it. Everything felt off, disjointed like a song out of tune. Her thoughts raced as she made her way to the park. She couldn't shake the feeling that time itself was shifting. Dr. Rowan was sitting on a bench near the old oak tree, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. He was scribbling something in a notebook, but his eyes flicked up as she approached. His expression was more serious than she had ever seen him. "Sit down," he said, motioning to the space beside him. Ellie hesitated, then took a seat. The moment her eyes met his, she knew something had changed. This was no longer a simple conversation between colleagues. This was something far more dangerous. "I did some calculations," Dr. Rowan began, his fingers drumming nervously against the pages of his notebook. "About the capsule, about the messages in it. I think it's... He paused, glancing around before lowering his voice. I think it's a warning from the future. Ellie felt a chill run down her spine. What do you mean, a warning? He took a deep breath, as if steadying himself. The capsule isn't just a time travel artifact. It's a piece of something much larger. A timeline that no longer exists. I believe the people who sent it were trying to stop something from happening in their time. And they thought by sending it to us, they could change the future. Ellie shook her head. But what does that have to do with me? Why would they send it to me? Dr. Rowan's gaze hardened. That's what I don't understand. You're not supposed to find it. Not yet, at least. Ellie's heart rate quickened. What do you mean? Dr. Rowan opened the notebook and handed her a page filled with dates, numbers, and strange symbols that made no sense to her. These are dates that correspond to key events in history. Events that shouldn't have happened but did. Things like the collapse of civilizations, wars that were never fought, lives lost, lives saved. It's all connected to what you found in that capsule. Ellie stared at the page, feeling the weight of his words sink in. So, this capsule is from a future that never existed? Exactly. Dr. Rowan leaned in closer, his voice low. What I'm trying to say is that the timeline is malleable. If you change one thing, just one thing, the entire course of history shifts. The future you saw, the one in the letter, it's not set in stone. And the disaster it speaks of, that's the result of the timeline unraveling. What's happening now, what we're doing, this is the catalyst. Ellie felt dizzy, her breath quickening. So, we're in danger. The future's in danger. But how, what am I supposed to do? Dr. Rowan shook his head. I don't know. But I think the capsule might be more than just a warning. Think it's a key. A key to understanding how to stop this from happening. Ellie felt a heavy weight settle on her chest. A key to what? He didn't answer right away, as though the question itself was too dangerous to voice. Instead, he opened his bag and pulled out a small device, a metallic object that looked almost like a key itself, sleek, with intricate designs etched into its surface. Ellie's eyes widened. What is that? It's a temporal locator, Dr. Rowan said. A tool that can trace the changes in the timeline. If the capsule is connected to these shifts, we can use it to find out exactly what's happening. But it's dangerous. It can only work if we can figure out how the capsule fits into all of this. Ellie's mind raced. A temporal locator. A tool that could pinpoint the exact changes in history. She looked at the device, her fingers itching to touch it, but a gnawing feeling in her gut warned her that doing so could change everything. But how does this connect to me? She asked, her voice shaking. Why me? Because, Dr. Rowan said quietly, you're already a part of the timeline. You've been chosen, Ellie. The future you saw in that letter. It's your future. But it's a future that no longer exists. It was erased. And somehow you're still here. Ellie's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean, I was erased? Dr. Rowan's eyes softened. You've been caught in a loop, Ellie. A loop that spans across different timelines. You might not remember it, but you've lived this moment before. The disaster. It's already happened. But every time it does, you're brought back, stuck in the cycle. The capsule is your way out, but only if you make the right choice. Her head spun, and the ground seemed to tilt beneath her. So, I've been traveling through time. He nodded gravely. In a sense. And each time you're brought back, the timeline changes. The future you saw. It's just one of many possibilities. But it's one we can't afford to let happen. Ellie stood up, her hands trembling. I don't know what to do with all of this. How do we stop it? Dr. Rowan looked at her with a mix of sympathy and fear. You have to decide, Ellie. You always have. But the clock is ticking, and the timeline is slipping further out of control with each passing moment. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. The weight of the world seemed to press down on her shoulders, and as she looked at the temporal locator in Dr. Rowan's hands, she realized that the decision she was about to make could change everything, or destroy it all. The park around her seemed to blur, the trees swaying in the wind, the world itself seeming to shift before her eyes. There was no going back. She had to make a choice. Ellie's hand trembled as she reached for the temporal locator. The device hummed faintly, a cool pulse beneath her fingertips. Her mind raced with the implications of what Dr. Rowan had told her. A loop. A future erased and rewritten. Each time she was pulled back into this moment, forced to make a choice she didn't understand. What if we can't stop it? Ellie asked quietly, her voice barely a whisper. Dr. Rowan didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on the device in her hand, his expression grave. After a long silence, he finally spoke. We don't have a choice. This is how it works. Every time the disaster happens, the timeline resets. But it doesn't reset perfectly. Each time it fractures more. If we don't act now, the fractures will become irreparable. And that's when the true disaster will begin. Ellie squeezed her eyes shut, her chest tight. The weight of the words pressed down on her. She had already lived this moment, this conversation, in countless other timelines. She was certain of it. But none of those timelines had ended well. Not for her. Not for anyone. You're telling me that I've been living through this, Ellie said slowly. And each time I've made a different choice? And now I'm stuck. Yes, Dr. Rowan said. You're stuck in a loop, but you're not the only one. Everyone involved in this timeline, in this event, is stuck too. The capsule you found. It's part of a bigger mechanism. A reset mechanism. You're part of that mechanism. And the key to getting out of this loop is breaking the cycle. Ellie looked down at the locator again, her fingers still gripping it. She didn't understand how it worked, but she could feel its power. It was a tangible force, one that called out to her, urging her to make a decision. What if breaking the cycle means? She paused, the fear creeping up her spine. What if breaking the cycle means the end of everything? Dr. Rowan's eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw a flicker of doubt. It's possible. But we don't have many options left. The disaster is coming, Ellie. The timeline is unstable. The more we wait, the harder it will be to fix. Every choice you make affects the outcome. You've seen it, everything you do changes something. It's the only way we can fight this. But how do we fight something we don't even understand? Ellie's voice cracked. How do I know what choice is the right one? You can't know, Dr. Rowan said quietly. But you have to choose. You have to decide whether to risk everything, or let the cycle continue until there's nothing left. Ellie felt her heart race. The truth of his words was clear. She had seen this play out before, but each time she had chosen wrong. The disaster was inevitable, no matter what she did. But now, with the locator in her hand, she felt a glimmer of hope. Possibility. She had a chance to stop it, to rewrite the timeline. Or destroy it. Her mind flashed to the capsule, the letter, the warning. The disaster cannot be stopped, it had said. But the letter had also said, you are the key. Could it be true? Was she really the key to the future? Or was she just part of the cycle, doomed to make the wrong choice once more? I don't know if I can do this, Ellie whispered. You can, Dr. Rowan said, his voice firm. You're the only one who can. Ellie clenched her jaw. She could feel the weight of the decision hanging in the air, the world pressing in on her from all sides. Her future, the future of everyone she loved, depended on her. But which future would she choose? The world around her seemed to slow as she thought of all the lives that had been affected by this event. People she hadn't even met. The cities she had never seen. The timeline she had never considered. Was she willing to risk it all to stop the disaster? Or was she too afraid to act? The locator pulsed again, its hum filling the silence. Ellie turned it over in her hands. It was so small, so seemingly insignificant. But it held the power to change everything. She could feel it in her bones, a deep, undeniable truth. I can't do this alone, Ellie said suddenly, her voice hardening with determination. We need to find out more. There has to be more information. We can't keep guessing and hoping for the best. Dr. Rowan nodded. I agree. We need to find the origin of the disaster. If we can pinpoint the exact moment when it all started to unravel, we might have a chance to reverse it. Ellie turned to him, her mind already spinning with possibilities. But how do we find it? How do we trace the fracture? Dr. Rowan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small device, something that looked similar to a portable scanner. He held it up to her. This is a temporal probe. It's designed to track fluctuations in the timeline. It should help us pinpoint the exact location of the fracture. Ellie took the probe, her fingers brushing against his. Where do we start? We start with the capsule, Dr. Rowan said. It's the key. Everything points back to it. If we can decode the symbols, we might be able to unlock its secrets. It's our best shot. Ellie felt a surge of urgency. The capsule, the vial, a disc. They were all pieces of a puzzle she didn't yet understand. But she had to try. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt like she was on the right path, like she had a purpose beyond just surviving the cycle. Let's do it, she said, her voice steady. They didn't waste time. Dr. Rowan led her back to his lab, a small, cluttered room in the depths of the university. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old books and strange instruments, most of which Ellie had never seen before. He quickly moved to a workbench and began setting up the temporal probe, adjusting the dials with practiced ease. Ellie sat down at a nearby table, placing the capsule in front of her. She ran her fingers over the engravings, trying to make sense of them. They looked ancient, foreign, but somehow familiar. A chill ran down her spine as she traced the symbols again, trying to decipher their meaning. This is it, Dr. Rowan said, breaking her concentration. The temporal probe is ready. Let's see if we can pinpoint the fracture. Ellie nodded, taking a deep breath. The machine buzzed to life, lights flashing across its screen. It whirred and clicked, processing data at a rapid pace. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the machine. Then, a series of coordinates flashed across the screen, along with a map that seemed to shift in real time. Ellie leaned forward, her heart pounding. There, Dr. Rowan said, pointing to a small red dot on the map. That's where it began. Ellie's eyes widened. The coordinates matched a place she recognized. A city. The very place where the disaster was supposed to take place. I don't understand, she said. Why there? Dr. Rowan's face grew pale. It's not just a place. It's a time. The moment everything changes. Ellie stared at the screen, her mind racing. The disaster, the fracture, the key. All of it was tied to that moment. She had been standing on the edge of it all along, without even knowing it. Now we know where it began, Dr. Rowan said softly. But can we stop it? Ellie turned to him, the weight of the decision pressing down on her once again. The fracture was just a moment away. The question remained, would she make the right choice? Or would she, once again, fail to stop the disaster? Ellie stood at the edge of the precipice, both literally and metaphorically. The coordinates on the temporal probe screen had led them to the city, the heart of the disaster. The moment had arrived, but Ellie couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of dread that settled in her chest. She had seen it all before. Each time, every timeline had ended in chaos, in destruction, in tragedy. But now, with Dr. Rowan beside her, the capsule, and the locator in her hands, she had the tools to change it all. The question that gnawed at her was no longer if she could change the timeline, but should she? The streets were eerily quiet as Ellie and Dr. Rowan moved through the city, the only sounds being the faint hum of machinery from nearby structures. There was a palpable tension in the air, a heaviness that made the world feel suspended, as if time itself was holding its breath, waiting for them to make their move. The coordinates had brought them to an old, abandoned building at the outskirts of the city, an unassuming place that Ellie had never thought twice about. But now, as she stood before it, the weight of its significance was undeniable. The fracture point was here. The moment everything had gone wrong. What's our next step? Ellie asked, her voice barely a whisper. We go inside, Dr. Rowan said, his voice tight with determination. We find the source. This is where it all began. Ellie nodded, her stomach knotting. This wasn't just about stopping a disaster anymore. It was about understanding why it had to happen in the first place. The timeline had already been rewritten countless times, but each alteration had come at a cost. She had to believe that this time this choice would be different, that it could be different. Together, they crossed the threshold into the building, their footsteps echoing in the hollow space. Dust hung in the air, and the smell of decay lingered. The once grand structure had been reduced to little more than a shell, the walls crumbling and the floorboards rotting. The passage of time had taken its toll. Yet, despite the disrepair, Ellie could sense something else beneath the surface. A presence, something alive within the ruins. As they moved deeper into the building, Ellie's heart raced. The air grew colder, the shadows longer. The pulse of the temporal locator thrummed in her palm, its rhythm growing faster, more urgent. She could feel it now. The fracture, the tear in the fabric of time, pulling at her, as though it wanted to drag her back into the cycle. At the far end of the room, hidden behind a pile of broken debris, they found it. The source. Ellie's breath caught as she stared at the object before her. It was a machine, but not like any machine she had ever seen. It was sleek, almost organic in its design, with tendrils of metallic wiring that seemed to pulse with energy. It hummed with a low frequency, vibrating in the air around them. Ellie approached cautiously, the weight of its power suffocating her. "What is it?" she asked, her voice shaky. "This is it," Dr. Rowan said. "The core of the fracture. The cause of everything. This machine. It's the mechanism that started the unraveling. It's what caused the timeline to break." Ellie felt the ground shift beneath her, as though the floor was no longer solid. She reached out instinctively, her hand hovering just above the machine. The hum grew louder, and a sudden vision flashed before her eyes. She was standing in the middle of a city, watching as people walked by. Faces she recognized, faces she didn't. A younger version of herself crossed the street, oblivious to the danger that loomed. A scream echoed in the distance, but Ellie couldn't place its source. The scene shifted, fragmented, and then it was gone, replaced by another. A vision of Dr. Rowan standing beside the machine, his face pale, his expression twisted in fear. "No," Ellie whispered, her heart pounding. She pulled her hand back, the image fading. Dr. Rowan stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the machine. "This is what caused it. The fractures. Time loop. It was never meant to happen, Ellie. Whoever designed this machine, they weren't trying to destroy time. They were trying to save it. But they couldn't control it. And that's why we're here." Ellie blinked, trying to make sense of his words. "Save time." He nodded. This machine was meant to rewrite a single event. Disaster. A point in time where everything went wrong. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The capsule, the messages, it's all connected to this. But it went wrong. The machine couldn't stop the disaster. It only delayed it. And now the fractures are spreading. The timelines are unstable. And you've been caught in the middle of it. Ellie's mind reeled. The disaster. The future. It wasn't just one moment. It wasn't just about preventing one terrible event. It was about rewriting everything. Every moment, every choice, every life. And in doing so, it had shattered time itself. "So, the people who sent the capsule," she began, her voice trailing off. "They were trying to fix it," Dr. Rowan finished for her. "But they couldn't. The machine. The key to the future. It was too much for them. They couldn't control it. And now it's your turn to make the choice." Ellie stared at the machine, the weight of his words sinking in. Choice. The same choice that had been placed in front of her countless times before. The one she had always failed to make. The choice that would either destroy everything or restore it. "Do you think we can fix it?" Ellie asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Rowan didn't answer immediately. He stepped closer to the machine, his hands shaking as he inspected the wires. His brow furrowed in concentration. "I don't know. But I know one thing for sure." Ellie looked at him, her breath catching in her throat. "What? We don't have any other choice," he said quietly. "This is it. If we don't act now, it will collapse on itself. The fractures will spread. The timeline will be beyond saving. We've been given a chance. This is our last shot." Ellie's pulse quickened as she looked at the machine. The weight of the decision pressed on her, suffocating her. She could feel the pull of the timeline, the force of time itself, urging her to make a choice. She had always been able to sense when the timeline was unstable, when the fabric of reality was on the verge of tearing. But now, as she stood before the machine, it felt like everything was closing in on her. "Do you think we can change the future?" Ellie asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dr. Rowan turned to her. His eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "I hope so. But I don't know. All we can do now is try." Ellie stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached for the machine's core. The locator in her pocket pulsed in response, its hum growing louder as if urging her to act. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and placed her hand on the machine. Everything went quiet. The world seemed to stop moving, the air thick with tension. Ellie felt the hum of the machine vibrate through her entire body, its pulse resonating in her chest, in her bones. It was as if time itself had come to a standstill. The fracture, the tear in the timeline, was here, and she was the one who had to repair it. And then, as her fingers touched the surface of the machine, the pulse stopped. For a long, heart-stopping moment, there was only silence. Ellie held her breath, waiting for something, anything to happen. Her pulse raced, her thoughts scattered. Had she done it? Had she fixed it?